Not too long ago, I saw a viral video compilation of thieves in low-income areas. People filling up baskets with items and walking out the door, breaking windows, threatening cashiers, that kind of stuff. But one of the 3-second clips in the compilation was something different. In the clip, we can see a group of people walking over a broken glass door, slowly marching. It looks like a riot, but there's more to it. I was there, and I want to tell the whole story. This happened a few years ago. Before heading off to college, I wanted to save up some extra money. I used to live in a pretty shitty neighborhood, and there were only 2 options for a side gig. One was at the local bar, and the other was at a convenience store. I applied at the convenience store, had a quick interview with the manager, and started the following Monday. Now I gotta stress just how run down this place was. This was the kind of place where the same homeless man sits outside every day, all day, where there were no baskets to carry stuff in. They'd been stolen too many times. There were a dozen signs taped to the door with a dozen little rules, all to prevent the various grifts and thefts that had been attempted over the years. No bags, no backpacks, no plastic bags, no canvas bags, no carts, and of course no weapons. Still, despite its faults, it was the only place local folks could afford to shop at, and while there were some people who took advantage of it, a vast majority loved the place. Right down to the homeless guy chilling by the door. I was planning to be there for the summer. We had a morning and evening shift, and we changed who did what every 2 weeks. The video clip in question took place during my 4th week, my 2nd week at the evening shift. It was a Saturday evening. Benny, the homeless guy, was off to recycle some cans. The AC was acting up, leaving a thin layer of humidity on everything in the store, including me. I was working the counter. It was almost closing time, but I waited for Benny to get back before closing. The guy was harmless and survived on little to nothing. He usually spent what he'd earned during the day before closing time. I wasn't working alone. There was also Lonnie, a mother of 3 who wanted to get some extra money on the side while her husband was posted overseas. A woman in her mid-40s with this long black hair that could almost reach her knees. Every time I think of her, I'm reminded of oatmeal cookies. We were ready to close when a customer walked in. I was expecting Benny, so when I turned to see a complete stranger, I was a bit surprised. Now, we get new people all the time, but this one was unusual for a number of reasons. 1, he was clearly not a local. The guy was wearing a brand-name blazer and custom-tailored pants. 2, he was in a hurry. He was clutching this brown canvas bag, panting like a tired dog. I didn't get the time to ask him to hand it over, as per the sign.
You got salt?
He asked. What?
Mineral salt.
Yeah, go check. He was sprinting down the aisle before I had a chance to finish my sentence. Lonnie peeked out from the dairy aisle with a raised eyebrow. I shrugged. Moments later, there was some commotion. I went to check on the guy and saw that he'd pulled down 6 cans of salt on the floor, opened them, and drowned his bag in it. He was whining and pleading, repeating, "Come on, come on, come on," over and over. He was in distress, like his life depended on this. I didn't know what to do. I was going to call the police, but I wanted to de-escalate first. Still, I didn't want to talk to him. There was no telling what a guy in his state of mind might do. Instead, I stepped back, got my phone out, and talked to him as calmly as possible. "Sir, you can't do that in here," I said. "You need to pay and take this outside."
There's no time.
He said.
I can't. I'm sorry.
What happened next came out of nowhere. One moment, I was looking at this crazy guy covering the ground in salt. Next moment, pandemonium. Lanny screamed at me from the front counter. The lights began to flicker, then die, leaving the store in sudden darkness. Running up to the front counter, my jaw dropped. Lonnie had barely managed to close and lock the front door. There were at least 24 people outside, none of whom I recognized. These people were something else entirely. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them, but looking a little closer, you could see a few things were off. For example, there was a woman in a nightgown. She didn't even have shoes on. A little further back, there was a guy who looked like a political campaigner for a candidate I'd never heard of. And to the side was this really tall man who looked like a fancy sommelier, except the front of his shirt had been cut to shreds like he'd been run over by a lawnmower. These people were gathering around the storefront, poking and prodding for a way in. One of them smacked their hand flat on the glass. Lonnie was already calling the police. The store had security cameras once, but they had long since been wrecked. We just had these camera-looking things that were basically just a red light. It was mostly a deterrent rather than something functional, so there was no way for me to check how many people were really out there. Still, there were more than a few. I didn't even know that one of the front cameras actually worked, providing the clip in question later on. The strange man with the canvas bag was on his knees crying, like full-on wailing like a scared kid. It was eerie to see someone just break down like that. It's at that point you start to realize how serious something really is. We had managed to lock ourselves in. Lonnie was on the phone, trying to get the police to hurry. It wasn't easy to get them to come by this neighborhood. Apparently, it was viewed as a bit of a lost cause. They advised her to get out of there and let our insurance company deal with it. The fact that these people showed up out of nowhere didn't seem to bother them, and the fact that our lives were in danger was described as exaggerating. I have this one vivid memory of the beginning of that night. There was this neon sign for a bar across the road, and that was the only light that came through. All these strange people, backlit by this eerie red and blue. It was eerie. There was no way to tell what was going to happen next. Were they there for us? For the store? For the strange man? While Lonnie kept calling for help, I turned my attention to the stranger. He'd slumped down against one of the shelves and gone catatonic. He just sat there, staring at the bag. I pushed against his shoulder a bit, and he didn't seem to notice. I decided to check the bag. This too garnered no response. The bag contained a sort of metal thermos, a silvery gray container that had burst open. There was a navy blue liquid covering the inside of the bag, now drenched in salt. It had this faint smell of ammonia and had begun to harden into a gel. I did my best not to touch it.
It's too late.
The man whispered.
It's too late. It doesn't matter anymore.
What? I yelled. What doesn't matter? Who are you? He waved his head back and forth as if bobbing for an answer, but no words came to mind. He shook his head and sunk his face back into his hands. I tried to push him to answer, but he was just broken. There was no point in talking to him, and judging by the sounds coming from our storage, I didn't have time to stand around. I could hear Lonnie yelling at an emergency responder. I could hear a repeated metal clanking out back, like someone was beating the back door with a steel pipe. Then a grinding metal noise. It took me a moment to realize that they were moving the trash container out back, probably to get up on the roof. I rushed back to Lanny, who was hanging up the phone and trying again, desperate to get someone on the line who was ready to actually listen. I think they're on the roof, I stuttered. I think they're climbing.
Shit.
She sniffled.
Shit.
She took me by the arm and led me to the back storage. There, she pointed to a frail metal ladder leading to a yellow hatch in the ceiling, about 12 feet up.
Make sure it's locked. Block it with something.
With what?
I don't know.
She stormed back out a second later. I grabbed a metal pipe from a vacuum cleaner and painstakingly made my way up the ladder. I managed to lock the hatch and jam the pipe between two handles. It wasn't very stable, but it would hold for a bit. It was probably some kind of rooftop maintenance hatch, most likely for ventilation purposes. The thing hadn't been opened in years. The rust on the metal rungs testified to that. As I was about to climb back down, I stopped. I looked back up. While the hatch was shut, I could tell there was something up there. There was this low huffing noise coming from it. Someone was pressing their face against the other side of the hatch, breathing against it. Out of some morbid curiosity, I crept a little closer. "What do you want?" I spat. "What the hell do you want?"
Home.
Something mumbled.
Go home.
It was such an eerie noise, like someone belching the words rather than speaking them. Like an involuntary, painful reaction. More seizure than speech. Home. Go home. Then a crash. I hurried down the ladder, rushing towards the front door. This was the scene shown in the clip. A few seconds that we got from the only security camera that intermittently worked. They had broken through the door and were slowly stepping inside. They didn't seem to be in a hurry. If anything, they seemed exhausted. For a second, Lanny and I just held our breaths. There was no way to tell what was going to happen. Finally, a man with a crowbar stepped forward. He looked at us and belched up something dark that covered his chest. Then, as if nothing happened, he walked right past us. The others followed. They were heading for the aisle with the strange man and the canvas bag. Lonnie had given up on calling for help and had resorted to filming instead. It was helpless, but the only thing we could do. We couldn't fight these people. We were outnumbered 10 to 1. I considered pushing past them and just running into the night, but I didn't want to go near them. There was no telling what would happen if you provoked them. These weren't ordinary people. I can't tell you what was wrong, but I can tell you something was. What happened next, you can't see in the clip. 24 people descended on that aisle, picking up that canvas bag and tearing it apart. They were rubbing the contents of the broken thermos thing over themselves, climbing over one another to get every little drop of it. It looked like a goddamn snake pit of arms, heads and legs. People just devolving into careless meat, completely devoid of conscious thought. Animals. Meanwhile, the strange man was just sitting there, catatonic. As the bag was torn to pieces, a handful of the intruders sort of flopped over. They lay flat on their back, letting their legs and feet curl into something resembling dead branches. Others were making these excruciating, hungry, whining noises, desperately weeping at the empty bag. Then they turned their attention to the stranger. One of them clawed at his leg. He shook them off. Then another did the same.
No,
he said.
no.
It was this weak little grunt, like the man was fighting himself to realize what was about to happen. Lonnie and I shared a terrified look.
The fire extinguisher.
Lonnie whispered.
Get the fire extinguisher.
It was across the store. As soon as I turned my back on them, I heard the strange man's groaning no grow more desperate. It went from a mumble to an angry yell to a desperate plea. Then it was just screaming, blood-curdling screaming, gaining and losing in strength. I got the fire extinguisher and ran back towards the aisle, meeting Lanny halfway. She had this haunted look on her face and shook her head. She couldn't close her mouth, like her face was stuck in a panicked, silent scream. She covered her mouth with her hands, shaking like dry leaves.
Oh my god.
She huffed.
Oh my fucking god.
I didn't see much. There was blood, but like thick blood. Chunks of it. Tufts of hair, pieces of a torn shirt, bone. A couple intruders were rolling around the bloodied floor like it was catnip. Others were slowly getting up, disillusioned and desperate. One older man, covered mouth to toe in dripping blood, pointed a shaking finger at me and Lanny.
Them?
He coughed.
Maybe them?
Then they came for us. I didn't realize what was about to happen until they smiled. They clung to this primal hope that we, somehow, had something they needed. Lonnie snapped me out of it, dragging me into the back storage. She fumbled the keys and locked the double doors while I used a broom handle to bar them. There were still banging metal noises coming from both the ceiling hatch and the back door. Then a voice, one.
Them!
It wheezed.
Them!
And from the back door, another voice parroted it. Like a rising storm, the word swept over the invaders until we heard it everywhere. Them. We made our way to the lunchroom before I heard the broom handle crack. They were through the storage doors. Lanny was desperately dialing her phone while I locked us in the lunchroom, a tiny room with a shared bathroom, a window and a couple of lockers. I could hear wet skin slap against the window, but I couldn't see what it was. The curtains were drawn.
Fucking yes.
Lonnie cried into her phone.
Yes, it's me again. They're getting in, they're...
The window broke. Before I even saw someone, I pulled the safety pin from the extinguisher and blasted it. Laney fled into the bathroom, locking it behind her. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. Someone was crawling through the broken glass of the window. I could see the rough stains of blood against the powdered white. The lunchroom door buckled. I could hear flesh hit concrete as the hatch in the storage broke outside. Someone fell through. It sounded like a hard boot coming down on a wet cabbage. They were breaking through, slowly but but surely, all to the sound of a rhythmic them, them. I swung a locker open, but realized there was no way I could hide in there. I couldn't go for the window. I couldn't push past the doors. This was it. It was it. To this day, I lay awake thinking about what I felt in that moment. That ice-cold primal panic, forgetting to breathe, feeling your tongue drying up as your airways open up, preparing for a death scream. Then Lonnie pulled me into the bathroom. It was tiny. It was meant for, at best, one average-sized person. I fell backwards, landing with my back against the toilet. Lonnie climbed over me to lock the door just as someone reached the handle. The door opened inwards, so I put up my legs and locked my knees. Lonnie fumbled around in the sink where she'd put her phone. Someone was still on the line, but I suspect all they could hear was our desperate screams and that ever-present mantra of them. The hinges were shaking. The metal handle rattled. I could count every nail on the door and see the minuscule movements as they slowly rolled out. In that moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat and how it slowly synced up to the monotonous chant of them. Looking back at it, my mind is just black. There's nothing there. It's like trying to remember a vague nightmare, something that happened to an unreal version of yourself. And in those moments when you realize that you were there, the real you, then it spirals. And for a couple of skipped heartbeats, I'm back there, fighting for my life. I'm back with that chant, that banging on the door. At one point, the door buckled. Fingers poked through the gap, grabbing Lonnie's long black hair. They tore out a handful of it, like a full fist. Even in all that panic, I saw her scalp turning red. But we pushed back, and the door stayed shut just a little longer. It was still dark, but with every push against the door, and with every inch the door gave, little glimpses of moonlight came through like a sickening strobe light, but a little longer was all we needed. The final thing I heard them say was, no, home, please, home. Then this combination of home, them, please, and no. The banging slowly stopped. My hearing went from that awful mantra to my own heartbeat, and then nothing. A light breeze, perhaps, a careful knock. Laney and I held our breaths.
Excuse me, y'all doing all right in there?
Benny, the homeless guy. The coast was clear. Stepping out, there was no one but Benny left. The ground was covered in this black ash, stinking of ammonia and sulfur, but the attackers were gone. The place was a complete mess. Every window and door broken. You could see traces in the ash where people had dragged their feet before they seemingly disappeared. Going back out into the store, there was no sign of the strange man. There was still blood spatter covering the side of the aisle, but now the ground was covered in that awful black ash. I stepped over the broken front door, past the trampled flowers and broken glass. I have this vivid memory of blue petals from a sunflower getting stuck to the side of my black work shoes as I went out into the night. Minutes later, the police showed up, and the rest is history. The whole event was categorized as a sort of riot. No suspect was arrested, and the strange man was never identified. From what I've heard, they never investigated anything as a murder or assault. For all intents and purposes, that night was just a strange break-in. So yeah, somehow that clip made its way into a random compilation online. I'm not sure how. Lonnie sent me the link. It's been a few years, but we still keep in touch. Not a lot, though. Seeing one another kind of reminds us about that night, and I think both of us just wants to forget. I guess what I want to say is that some things are different from what they seem. So think twice before you share something. Take a step back, think, and really look. There should have been 21 assignments for me to grade, and yet I was looking at 22. It didn't make any sense. I double and triple checked the pile of papers, but there was no mistake. I only had 21 students, and yet there were 22 pages to grade. I was hunched over my desk, going through the pages one by one. I took note of all the names, trying to find the extra assignment. They were all simple essays where they described what they'd done during winter break and what they were most looking forward in the coming year. A simple English assignment. In the middle of the pile, there was one paper that clearly stood out. It was barely legible, and there was no signature. The text was written in squiggly lines with a red pen, pressed so hard into the paper that it had punched several holes.
I'll be free,
The paper said.
I got out, and she has no idea there's two of us now.
The paper was barely legible. Half-finished sentences describing a sudden awakening. Thoughts of breaking things. Describing people as disposable objects. Hearing a voice in the mirror.
My friend gave me a flower, and now I'm here.
There was a scribbled drawing of a blue sunflower in the corner of the paper. It was the strangest thing I'd ever read. Yeah, I'm a teacher. The kids I teach are on the edge of turning into teenagers. It's an awkward age, but it is that space in a young person's life where you can really make an impact. If you can make them feel seen and heard, they might gain a confidence that'll follow them for the rest of their lives. I have 21 students in my class, 8 boys and 13 girls. The day after I graded that paper, I didn't know what to think or say. After I took attendance, it dawned on me. Whoever handed in that paper was in the room right now. It threw me off my tempo. I had them do some individual assignments while I found my bearings. It was the usual ruckus, bickering and joking, awkward teenage flirting, loud discussions about whatever was new online. But something felt different, malevolent. It had to be one of the girls. The paper had hinted at it. But which one? I handed out an extra assignment. Nothing fancy. I just took the crazy paper out of the bunch and distributed the rest randomly to the students. For tomorrow, they were to write a short essay telling me about what they'd read in the other student's essay. Reading comprehension and writing at once? No one would have a problem with that except the students. As I got back home with some takeout sushi, I looked over the strange paper again. There were some smudges going left to right. No matter if you're right-handed or left-handed, that'll happen. But further down, there were more smudges. It looked like the writer had held the pen like a hook, with the pen facing the writer. It indicated a left-handed writer. I double-checked with a few articles online, which said the same thing. But there were no hook-handed writers in my class, I would have noticed. But I was sure there were a few left-handed people. I finished my sushi and went to bed with a chilling feeling that I was missing something obvious. The next day I got the assignments, all 21 of them, no extras. I breathed a sigh of relief, figuring that maybe someone had just played a cruel prank on me. We got through the classes of the day without a hitch. We even managed a fairly successful math quiz. All in all, I wasn't complaining. The extra assignment wasn't that important, but I took them home to grade them anyway. Some had put some effort into their work, and I wanted to reward them. No matter the age, everyone loves gold star stickers, and I had plenty on my crafts table. I started going through the papers only to notice something. There were once again 22 of them. At some point during the day, someone had snuck an extra paper in there. Going through the pages, I couldn't help but to feel that bubbling sense of dread. One of these papers was going to be terrifying. It felt like getting slowly pricked by a needle. At first, there's just a pressure, but you know the hurt is coming. It was at the bottom of the pile, red ink, barely legible. Spots from a hook-handed writer.
I know you've caught on,
The paper said.
I want you to know. I want you to chase.
There were little sketches of drops of blood falling into an open mouth. Crude but clear.
Chase me. I chase you.
I didn't sleep well that night. I pulled the curtains. I double-checked all the locks. I pulled the covers up tight, and I left the light on in the hallway. And yet, I still had that awful sinking feeling that I was missing something. Was it Claire? She'd always been a bit of an oddball. Or maybe someone I'd never expect, like Shonda, maybe Petra, Fiona. I had this mental image of someone following me to my car, a young girl hiding in the back seat, a maniacal smile popping up in the rearview mirror, sharp little nails and unblinking eyes diving towards me, cutting my throat open as I'm going 70 meters down the freeway. I didn't sleep well that night. I started imagining shadows passing by in the hall, in the corner of my eye. A few days passed. I started taking notes on the girls in class. I checked what pens they had and which was their main hand. If it was just a matter of someone pranking me, it might be enough just to find a left-handed girl. However, no girl in my class was left-handed, and no one owned a red ink pen. I also had a chat with the school counselor. They couldn't betray patient confidentiality, but they could tell me whether they were aware of any problems that might explain this. They weren't. If anything, they seemed more worried about me. Since this started, I'd seemed a bit on edge. They didn't blame me, but they wanted to make sure I was taking care of myself. I tried several tricks. I tried monitoring the hand-ins. I tried watermarking the papers. I tried all kinds of tricks, but I got nothing. At the end of the day, I kept getting outsmarted. It was as if the paper just appeared out of nowhere, sometime during the day. I couldn't pin it on anyone. I tried to just forget about it, but every time I graded a paper, I feared that another threat would show up. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. But the times it did, it just ruined me. That peaceful moment of grading papers and listening to audiobooks had turned into a horrific slideshow.
I'll show you.
One of the notes said.
I'll break a light in your house.
The same day, the kitchen light stopped working. It didn't look broken, but how could I possibly tell? One of those days, as I was chopping leeks in the kitchen, I got this awful sinking feeling in my stomach. Looking out the window, I noticed something. A silhouette. She was short, with long black hair. There was something wrong with the shape of her face. Her skin looked gray. For a moment, we just stared at one another. It took me a few seconds to realize that it wasn't just a face, it was a skull. Still clutching my kitchen knife, I stumbled away from the window. It had to be a mask. That wasn't a real face. It couldn't be. Suddenly the lights broke. All of them. The kitchen, the hallway, the bathroom. Hell, even my desktop lamp at my home office. All of them shattered, spreading searing hot shards across the floor with a violent bang. My ears rang and I dove for cover. It felt like a gunshot. Looking up, there was no one left outside. No mask, no kid, no nothing. I called the police, but there was little they could do. There had been a power surge, that much the electric company could confirm, but there were no witnesses of an intruder. I showed them the notes and filed a threat report. We had a long talk and they tried their best to calm me down. But at the end of the day, I was still alone, and someone was out there. I went through that image in my head 1,000 times. I had several girls in my class, but no one that fit what I'd seen. Her hair was too long. She was too short, too skinny. I couldn't think of anyone that fit that description, but she'd been there, no doubt in my mind. And I had this gnawing feeling that I'd seen her before. Over the next couple of days, I couldn't stop seeing her. She'd be across the road as I went to work in the morning. I'd see her pass by the window in the cafeteria, and one day as I was driving home, I saw her in the rearview mirror of my car, that gray death's head grinning at me. I was getting more notes, not just slipped into the hand-in assignments, but also just scattered around my apartment. At one point I snapped. I just stepped out of the shower. I'd put on a bathrobe and had started to dry my hair when I noticed a message on the bathroom mirror. There, written backwards, it simply said, "Chase me." I screamed as my heart sunk. I broke the bathroom mirror with my hairdryer. "What the fuck do you want from me?" I called out. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I barely noticed the glass shards cutting into my feet as I stormed out. I'd had enough. I had to do something. I couldn't live like this forever. Kid or not, this had to end. "Where are you?" I called out as I passed through my bedroom. "Where the fuck are you?" I glimpsed something outside the window. Of course she was around. Always there, always near. "Come out!" I screamed as I entered the kitchen. "Show yourself!" The moment I stepped into the kitchen, it shook. Every drawer, every door, every appliance, everything flung open as if pulled open by a steady hand. I was so frustrated I could cry. I just wanted it to end, but I was too scared to move. It felt like anything could happen at any moment, like the entire world was listening to me and reacting accordingly. I just stood there trying to remember to breathe. "Please," I whispered, "show yourself. Stop this." And as if to answer my call, she did. The front door creaked. The hinges rusted and fell apart. A gentle breeze was all it took for the door to break. She was so small. There was no doubt in my mind. She wasn't wearing a mask. She was nothing but bone. I backed away like an animal pushed into a corner. I tried to force myself to attack, to do something, but as a response, the kitchen shook again. This time, it was pandemonium. Cutlery crashed onto the floor. Plates rolled out of the dishwasher and broke apart. Glasses shot across the room like bullets. Even the little drawer of miscellanea collapsed in on itself, spreading knickknacks and rubber bands all over the room. "I've chased you," I screamed. "Are we fucking done? Is this it?" She raised a thin gray finger. She pointed at something in the corner. A dry blue sunflower. Something clicked in my head. That sense of missing something. It was still there, but this was the answer. Somehow, this was it. "What do you mean? What? Just talk. Don't just..." There it was at the first note. There'd been a drawing of a blue sunflower, and it said she'd gotten it as a present. This was that flower. I was sure of it.
I got out, and she has no idea there's two of us now.
That's what it had said. That was part of that very first note. She was talking about me. I'd written those notes myself. I'd handed in the assignments. That's how I never noticed it. I looked over at my crafts table. My writing pen was half empty by now. I had red smudges under my left hand. And then there was her. Of course, I'd seen her before. Time and time again. I had long black hair as a kid. I'd been skinny and short.
You found me.
Her little voice said.
Funny.
The images came flooding back. A shadow in the bathroom mirror. A simple hello and a flower offered. I remember taking the hand of an impossible being, reaching across a nightmare space to darken my inner child. This awful, malevolent being living at the core of my soul. Something dead and resurrected, trying to make room for madness. But it wasn't just madness, she was real. Doors don't rust by themselves, glasses don't throw themselves, and I can't for the life of my cause an electric surge with my mind. This was a real being, with real power, and she'd settled in the back of my mind, and now I'd chased her. I'd found her.
Do you want me to leave?
She asked.
I can.
I didn't know what to say. Of course I wanted her gone. I wanted it all to be over. But there was this gnawing feeling that there was more to it. She didn't just scare me and torture me for the fun of it.
Tell me to leave.
She insisted.
Set me free.
That was it, wasn't it? She wasn't free. She came from me, and so, maybe she was stuck with me. Maybe she couldn't leave. Maybe she couldn't hurt anyone else. Not as long as I'm around, it had said. I'll be free, in that first note. That meant she wasn't free as of now. To me, it suddenly made sense. Standing there, I just shook my head. You can't leave, can you? I cackled. You're just as stuck with me as I am with you.
I could kill you.
She laughed. No, you can't, can you? If so, why haven't you? There was no response. You need me to cut you loose to get out there, don't you? That I find you and just let go. I took a step forward and saw blood seeping out from the sole of my feet. My hands were rattling like leaves in the wind. I'm not letting go, I screamed. No fucking way.
I'll hurt you.
Do your fucking worst. But there was nothing more. In the blink of an eye, she was gone. But in my mind's eye, I could still see her. Every memory of seeing myself as a kid was tainted. I had memories of seeing myself in the mirror with a skeleton-faced grin. I remember seeing my reflection in water puddles. I knew that wasn't what I'd look like, but in my head, that was me. We were interchangeable. She was me, and I was her. Two beings, and I was gonna keep her here. I'll be a walking fucking jail. I know it sounds absurd, but she is real, and nothing I can do changes that. I couldn't live with that thing coming out, reaching other people, spreading. I can't work at the school anymore. She scares the children. I'm afraid of seeing other people. She hurts them whenever she gets the chance. I've seen birds fall out of the sky, a family of moles lying dead at my doorstep, circles of roadkill lined up around my car. I've been thrown, cut, burned, and beaten, but I haven't succumbed. She is just as scared of me as I am of her. I had to write this down. If you're reading this, something has happened. Maybe an accident, maybe I've grown sick. I've set up for this to be posted as my post-mortem, as an explanation for my eccentric behavior. It's on a 7-day timer, so if I haven't confirmed my status by that time, it is safe to say I'm not around anymore. And if I died, I pray to God I took her with me. I don't want to think about what that thing could do if set free. When my mom and dad retired, they got themselves a house in Greece, leaving me to care for the family home on my own. I didn't mind. It was better than trying to buy something on my own. Still, a 2-story home for a single man in his early 30s? That's a bit much. I lost my job during the pandemic, and with prices on the rise, I decided to start renting out parts of the space I wasn't using. There was enough room upstairs to house at least a couple of college students, and a spacious basement for another. Just this large one-room basement that basically covered the entire underside of the building, supported by these thick concrete beams. It wasn't the kind of place I'd usually consider renting out, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to offer, as long as I was honest about the state of things. I spent a good month just preparing the spaces, clearing out the upstairs and moving things from the basement to a long-term storage facility. At first it looked like we had some water damage to deal with, but it turned out to be a false alarm. All in all, it was shaping up to be a pretty painless transition, and the rent would keep me afloat until I could get a proper job. I put out an ad on a couple of socials, one for the upstairs space, large enough to support at least a couple of people, and then the basement. I wasn't really sure about the basement, but I included a few pictures and hoped for the best. The price was cheap too. Cheaper than it should be, I guess. I got a few applications for the upstairs space, but most of them were either really short-term or started arguing about the price. One guy just showed up and tried to walk straight in without calling first. It was a weird time. I didn't get any calls about the basement though, so I figured I just screwed that up. It was early October when I had a knock at the door. The classic da-da-da-da-da kind of knock. I hurried to open, still browsing job openings on my phone and chewing on a piece of cold pizza from the prior night. It's hard to explain how surprised I was to see what I saw. Most other applicants had been either young guys or college girls. What was now standing in front of me was a family of 4. A mother and father, both in their mid-40s, and 2 young boys ranging from 10 to 14 years old. The mom had this autumn-colored cotton dress with a little ribbon, and the dad had this fancy black overcoat, a white shirt with a red tie. Both kids were dressed up in identical blue shirts. At first, I thought they were there to try and convert me to something. I could easily imagine them with a set of Bibles. Instead, the dad stepped forward, offering me a handshake. I accepted.
Hi there.
He said with a warm smile.
We're the Walters. We're here about the ad.
Oh, hello, I answered. It might get a bit crowded, but you're free to have a look. Sorry about the, I vaguely gestured to my unprepared state, but the dad just shook his head.
Not at all. Hope we're not imposing.
I invited them inside and they went right past the stairs. I figured they just missed it. Excuse me, I said. It's right up here,
Oh, we know.
smiled the mom.
We're here about the basement.
So there's this long wooden staircase that spirals into the basement. It's one of the main reasons I don't like going down there or furnishing the place. That spiral makes it almost impossible to bring down any proper furniture. It's infuriating. But all 4 members of this picture-perfect family stepped down, all composed. They were courteous and respectful, with just the polite amount of excitement. But I got the sense that there was something just off about them. The dad brought out some measuring tape and started checking the walls. They asked me about the lack of windows, the air quality, their ability to bring down some furniture and put up some light fixtures. I agreed to all of it. I still couldn't believe they were actually considering it. This was clearly not a space meant for a family of 4, and they gave the impression that they were pretty well off. There was no reason for them to rent a space like this. Still, as they finished their inquiries, the mother approached me.
Would you mind stepping upstairs and just walking around a bit?
She asked.
We'd like to see how much sound carries through.
A strange way to ask for soundproofing, but I did as she asked. I got up the stairs, put on my heaviest boots, and just wandered around for a bit. After a couple of minutes, I turned the corner only to see all 4 of them standing in the hallway. Picture perfect as always. all with a big smile on their faces.
We're very pleased.
The mother said.
We'll take it.
They signed a 6-month rent agreement, and I got to know them a little better over the next few weeks as they sporadically dropped by. There was Layla, the mother, Anders, the father. The kids were Aiden, 12, and Alvin, 13. Apparently, they were in between housing and wanted something small and cheap in the interim. Despite all that, I couldn't shake the feeling that a basement was a strange choice for them. Still, I needed the money, and they were eager to get it done. They even offered to pay a little extra since they were bringing in more people than I'd anticipated. About a week later, they showed up for the official move-in. Layla and Anders insisted on bringing in everything in themselves, and that I shouldn't be bothered with any heavy lifting. Apparently, just letting them stay there was favor enough. They brought in about a dozen pieces of furniture covered in blue tarp in various sizes, along with a dozen or so large cardboard boxes. None of them marked. They put down several hand-woven carpets, the kind you'd see in a large mansion. Layla was a stay-at-home mom, while Anders worked as some kind of security manager for a nearby airport. He worked odd hours, anything from 12-hour shifts to all-nighters and everything in between. He was also on call for most hours of the day and sometimes had to leave with short notice. It was strange, though. One might think a person like that would need space with good cell coverage. But that basement barely had a single bar. There was Wi-Fi, but it was spotty at best. For some reason, none of this seemed to bother them. That first week living with the Walters was not a problem. Most of the time, I forgot they were even there. I only saw them leave the basement a handful of times, and they didn't make any noise. At most, I could hear them stomping up or down that creaky old staircase a couple of times. But that was mostly Anders heading to work. In fact, I never saw Aiden and Alvin leave for school. I figured they were being homeschooled, further pushing the idea that this family might have some kind of religious background. Still, they were hardly an issue. I was still working hard on finding someone to rent the upstairs, but I was having no luck. I'd considered lowering the price, but after the Walters moved in, money was becoming less of an issue. Anders even suggested that I apply for a job at the airport. He knew one of the HR people looking for hires in various departments. Having been jobless for 5 months, I was willing to try pretty much anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't telling me the whole story. I kept coming back to one thought: what the hell they were even doing down there? Once, I decided to get a better look at what they'd done with the place. At that point, I hadn't even seen how they decorated it. It was in the middle of the afternoon, and I had no idea whether they were even down there or not. Their car was gone from the driveway. I knocked a couple of times, and when there was no response, I used my key to get down. As I turned the corner, it was deathly quiet and completely dark. I turned on the lights. They all slept in these basic single beds, all spaced out along the easternmost wall. They had a small love-seat couch, along with a couple of basic plastic chairs, facing a thick old TV placed against the wall. There was an empty bookshelf and a couple of scattered carpets along the floor. I could see a few open boxes. There was a bathroom next to the staircase, but it looked unused. No toothbrushes or anything. It took me a few moments to realize that I wasn't alone. The entire family was standing in a line along the southernmost wall, furthest away from the staircase. They were standing in order of size from tallest to smallest, remaining perfectly still, just looking at me. It wasn't until they noticed me seeing them that they reacted. They all looked up at me, putting on a friendly smile.
Can we help you?
Asked Layla.
I hope we didn't make too much noise.
Continued Anders. The kids just nodded in unison. I took a good look at them, but I couldn't figure out what I was looking at. I had no explanation for their behavior. Sorry, I was just gonna check the water pressure, I lied. I tried knocking.
That's all right.
Smiled Anders.
Go right ahead.
Walking back up the stairs, a thought hit me. If they were all down there, why was their car gone? Who'd taken it? I had a number of strange interactions with them over the next couple of weeks. For example, I once found Aiden, the younger of the two brothers, standing in the kitchen. He wasn't doing anything in particular, just standing there, staring at the spice rack. When I asked him about it, he just said he wasn't doing anything. After a while, he turned on his heel and ran back downstairs. I didn't see it, but I heard his little feet thump all the way down the staircase. Another time, I saw Layla standing in the open doorway, leading to the basement. She was just standing there, hand on the doorknob, looking right at me. I said, "Hello," and she said it right back, but she wouldn't let me out of her sight. When I finally passed from her view, I could hear her running back downstairs. Not just hurrying, running. Another time, I saw Anders in the car out on the driveway. I saw him from the upstairs window, just sitting there, hands on the steering wheel, for a good 15 minutes. No radio or nothing, just him alone in his car. But the strangest interaction came one night when I was going to the kitchen to get a Coke. I spotted Layla standing in the kitchen, fridge wide open. I could see her silhouette illuminated by the fridge bowl. Her long black hair, wet from a fresh shower. Standing in a hastily tied bathrobe, her feet bare. At first I didn't see anything strange. She was just standing there. She wasn't getting anything. It was more like she was bathing in the light. I thought about calling out to her, but something about her demeanor made me want to sneak back into my bedroom. Then I saw it. There was something wrong with her ear. Her left ear was about 3 inches higher up than her right one, without her bending her neck. Her scalp seemed lightly tilted, and there was something about the way she moved her fingers that didn't look natural. They pointed in different directions, like her hand was ever so slightly fractured. I just stayed there for a while, looking at her from a distance, watching her shoulders rise and fall as she took deep breaths, inhaling the cold. When she turned my way, I only saw her for a moment, her torso moving first, and her legs following, like a stilted claymation puppet. I managed to slip around the corner and heard her rush back towards the basement, her feet tapping against the hallway carpet in an uneven rhythm. When she got to the door, she stopped. I was leaning against the wall, listening from the other room. I heard her step around for a bit. Then there was a snap, a popping limb, something finding its way back into a socket. Her steps resumed a natural pattern as she hurried downstairs. I just stayed there for a while, trying to keep calm. For all intents and purposes, I might have just been seeing her in a weird light. It was dark and I was sleepy. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unnatural about her. That I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. From that day forward, I got more suspicious. I didn't go into the hallway at night, and I did my best to avoid the basement door altogether. I tried my best to just put them out of my head. I went back to focus on getting a job and a second tenant for the upstairs space, both of which proved to be a challenge. But I was making progress. The TSA was hiring, for example. Not the most glamorous job, but it'd be solid work. There was a couple of college students who came by to check the upstairs floor, a young couple who needed a place to stay while they finished up their master's degrees. They seemed like solid people, and we got along just fine. They knew the place wasn't the most glamorous, but it was a neat short-term solution while they finished up the upcoming semester. The only problem was the Walters family, who I had yet to introduce them to. I remember knocking on the basement door, having the young couple standing behind me expectantly. Albin, the oldest of the brothers, chimed in with a cheerful, "Come in." As we stepped downstairs, the family of four was standing in a picture-perfect 2x2 formation. Mom and Dad in the back, 2 kids in the front, all dressed in their Sunday best, with a freshly printed smile across their faces. The whole scene was so absurd, like some kind of misplaced commercial from the 1950s.
Hello.
Giggled Layla.
Aren't they the most handsome couple, Anders?
They sure are, Layla. What do you think, kids?
And in unison, without skipping a beat, the kids answered,
They sure are handsome.
For the next 20 seconds or so, this uncomfortable silence grew between us. The Walters just stood there, smiling at us, waiting for some kind of response. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't help but to feel that I was missing something obvious. Was Layla's eye color a bit different? Was Albin's face a bit lopsided? Was Ander's missing a finger? Or did he just stand in a weird angle? Maybe they'd been strange all along. Maybe it was only now that I was seeing it. When we finally parted ways, I followed the young couple outside. They both turned to me, their faces ashen. One of them just stuttered, but the other managed to form a few words.
We're not one to judge,
She said,
but those people give me the creeps.
"You You won't be seeing much of them then.
Yeah, see, that's my point. Who does that? What kind of family willingly lives in a basement?
It's only a temporary measure, I assure you. By then, the other chimed in.
What's with the boxes?
He asked.
What's in them?
Personal keepsakes, clothes, that kind of stuff.
No, I mean, the box that moved, the blue one.
The discussion died down and they said their goodbyes. I got the feeling that they wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Still, their words lingered in the back of my head. A box that moved? Really? How'd I miss that? After countless sleepless nights, I decided to finally get some answers. I had to take a little risk and figure this out once and for all. So one day I slipped a note under the door, informing them that we needed them to clear out the basement for one afternoon while a plumber did some repairs. I looked up a few plumbing things on Wikipedia and referenced a real company, making it look all official and stuff. Later that day, Layla and Anders dropped by holding hands, telling me that they'd be sure to be out for the day.
Maybe we'll go to the zoo.
Smiled Anders. Don't you have work? I asked.
It comes and goes.
He laughed.
We're very fortunate.
Very fortunate.
Agreed Layla.
So very fortunate.
At the designated time, the family was out of the building. They went for a drive in Anders' car, promising to return shortly. I told them it wouldn't take the plumber more than an hour. They seemed a little suspicious when they hadn't seen the actual plumber show up yet, and they let that suspicion hang in the air. Finally, I just straight up lied, giving them a fake name and asking whether they wanted me to call him. Layla didn't call my bluff, luckily, but as they pulled out of the driveway, I could tell I was sweating. I didn't even know what I feared, but my mind kept returning to that night when I'd seen her standing in the light of the fridge. I had no idea what they were hiding or what they might do if I found out about it. But there was a part of me that just wanted to get into my car and drive, and another part of me telling me I was being silly. When they finally drove away, I wasted no time. I hurried downstairs, turned on the light, and started to go through their stuff. It was an invasion of privacy, probably illegal. But if I wanted to sleep soundly again, I had to have an idea about why they were being so goddamn weird. There were a lot of oddities about their space. For example, all their beds were perfectly made, like no one had slept in them. Most of the couches and surfaces were covered in dust. I could tell the TV hadn't been on in a long time. It wasn't even plugged in. There were no phones or phone chargers, no laptops or desktop computers, just a bunch of boxes and underutilized furniture. I did find a Polaroid camera, though, at least 30 years old. I started checking their boxes. Just clothes, it seemed. All variations of what I'd already seen. Identical sets of shirts, pants, dresses, and shoes. At least 4 boxes worth. One box was just full of accessories like earrings, necklaces, glasses, hairspray, and fake nails. Another was full of decorations and knickknacks. Porcelain dogs, family photos, dried sunflowers and roses, both with strange colors and fancy vases. I took my time, carefully placing everything back the way I found it. It was odd, but nothing incriminating or downright unnatural. Still, I remember what that couple had said about a box that moved. I couldn't see anything like it. That is, until I turned to leave. Right by the side of the stairs, resting next to the pristine bathroom, was a large blue styrofoam cooler. It was the kind of thing that kind of blended into the background, like it had always been there. Still, I could clearly remember not owning one of those things. It looked old and torn, like it had been around for years. And maybe I was imagining things, but it looked like it was moving, pulsing, pressing against the surface, making little plastic squeals. There was a sound coming from it, like a low guttural growl pushed through a thin pipe, a sharp, rhythmic noise. It made the cooler rattle and shake ever so slightly. I froze, hoping it would quiet down. I held my breath and waited for it to settle. I slowly stepped back up the stairs. As I rounded the corner and lost sight of the cooler, I heard the styrofoam cover pop off, and the sound became clearer. A loud growl, shifting in pitch from high to low, like a singer doing some kind of sick vocal warm-up, trying to find the right pitch. Then something hit the floor with a painful yelp. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to identify the sound. It was like a cross between a dog and some kind of fox, a sharp, screeching tone. Then it scrambled to its feet. I could hear claws and paws scratch the floor, and something was coming my way, fast. There was something primal in me that told me to run. I hurried up the stairs, only looking back for a short glimpse as I shut the door behind me. I only saw it for a moment, something black with a single eye reflecting back at me, its skin tight and misplaced across the skull, teeth pointing in all directions, in seemingly random sizes, black drool dripping off an elongated tongue, a thing wearing the cheap suit of a black dog. As I slammed the door shut, I could hear a car pull up on the driveway. It had been less than 30 minutes. Maybe they had planned to catch me in the act. I heard them come in and head straight for the basement. Meanwhile, I was in the other room, throwing together a small bag with a change of clothes and a toothbrush. The moment I heard the basement door shut, I headed for my car. The moment I got in the car, I saw them step out of the house. They all stood there in the driveway, just looking at me. And right next to them was a beautiful black Labrador, happily wagging its tail. I didn't say a word. I just drove. I had to get some space between us and figure out what the hell I wanted to do. I wanted to go to the police, but there was no way to explain what I'd seen. What could they even do? Kick them out for having a dog? There was even a clause in the rental agreement that allowed them a pet. I had nothing to go on. I decided to spend the night at a motel just outside of town. I needed time to think and sleep without having the threat of something strange living under my feet. I couldn't get that image out of my head. That black thing in a dog suit. Like something trying to remember what a dog looked and sounded like in real time. I checked in at the motel and got a room on the first floor. I crawled into bed, put the TV on, and surfed a bit on my phone. I could feel myself relax for the first time in weeks, but every time I thought about that house and that family, I could feel my pulse stagger. I had no idea what to do or who to call, which is what led me to this site in the first place. A lot of you seem to have seen strange things. I figured I'd post here eventually, but it took me quite some time to build up the courage, mostly because of what happened later that night. I remember a tap on the door. I must have dozed off. I hadn't turned the TV off or brushed my teeth. I just woke up with this sour feeling in my stomach, that something was terribly wrong. I had closed the curtains so I couldn't see who it was. I thought about hiding under the bed or locking myself in the bathroom. My thoughts raced, but I tried to temper them with rational what-ifs. Maybe it was just housekeeping or a concerned manager. Then the knock came again, this time with a voice.
Mister,
Said Alvin Walters.
your mom wants to talk to you.
I didn't answer. For a few seconds, I carefully stepped out of bed, trying my best not to make any noise.
Mom wants to talk to you.
He repeated.
It's urgent.
There was no way they didn't know I was in there. They knew, and they wanted something. And whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. I sneaked to the back of the room as the doorknob started to rattle. I could hear Alvin again. This time, his voice shrunk to threatening lows, like the dark growl of an adult or elderly man.
Mom wants to talk to you.
I pulled open the curtains to a window facing the back of the building. I figured I could climb out the window, but as soon as those curtains opened, my heart skipped a beat. Right there was Anders, the father himself, just inches from the window, standing straight with his neatly tucked shirt illuminated by the sharp light of the single TV screen. An ever-courteous smile cemented on his face. He tapped the window.
Would you mind opening up?
He asked.
It won't take long.
Again, I looked a little closer, and again I could see little details that were just off. A slight droop of the lip that hadn't been there the day before. One eye pulled lower than the other, his hairline further forward than usual, like he'd rushed himself to look like a person. Another knock at the door, another knock at the window. Voices from the front and the back. Hell, maybe even room next door. Little voices, big voices, broken voices.
We just want to clear some things up.
Mom wants to talk.
It's not what you think.
I had to make a break for it, but for that, I needed to decide where to go. So I pulled the front curtains aside to to see how many of them were waiting up front. All 5 of them were standing out front. Mom, Dad, kids, and dog. I looked back, as if trying to convince myself I was sane. There were 2 dads, and none of them looked right. Further down the street in their car, I spotted 2 more kids identical to Aiden and Alvin, both with little quirks, like they weren't fully formed yet. A loose jaw, a strange eye. One of them had a wide bald spot. Stepping out of the motel manager's office, I saw another Layla, this one with a deflated arm and a paralyzed face. I was surrounded. I held up my phone like a weapon. "I'm calling the police," I yelled. "Get the fuck away from me,"
That'd be inconvenient,
said Anders.
And you'd be dead, added Aiden.
Long dead.
Chuckled Alvin, his voice not tuned right. The doorknob rattled again, more forceful this time. I could feel my pulse rising, my breath growing short. I looked back and forth, seeing the Anders at the back window, trying to figure out the lock. Only now did I see that one of his fingers were nothing but bone,
How about a trade?
suggested Layla.
Something for everyone.
What the fuck are you talking about?
Go inside that bathroom of yours, grab a piece of tissue and chew on it, then drop it out the window.
What? I couldn't understand what I was hearing. It's like the words were there, but didn't make any sense to me,
We're gonna need a new suit.
said Layla.
You will do.
You're not fucking wearing me.
Oh, we'll leave you alone. And you'll leave us alone. Because if you don't, people that look like you are gonna start doing some terrible things, aren't they, Anders?
Oh, they are, Layla.
Said an Anders.
Terrible, terrible things.
So that way, we can all walk away. You'll never see us again, and we'll leave you be.
I tried to wrap my head around it. They were gonna make suit out of me, like they'd done with that dog, and with that family. There would be someone looking like me, walking around out there. Something vile. But what choice did I have? I stepped into the bathroom and chewed up a piece of tissue. I spat it out and moved to the window. The family stepped back. I clicked the window open and flung the piece of tissue out with a flick of the finger. Layla picked it up and met my eyes with an unblinking gaze. With one clench of the fist, she grabbed the top of her head and pulled. Her entire face lurched backwards, her lower lip reaching all the way to her eyebrows. Underneath was just this black sludge, covering what looked like a deformed skull. She was like a walking oil slick, completely midnight black and slick as water. She pushed the piece of tissue inside herself before pulling her face back down. It took her a few seconds to realign, but she just couldn't get it to look right. She coughed a little. She waited. She nodded. And when she looked back at me, she did so with my own eyes, speaking with my own tongue. "Thank you," I heard myself say. "I think this will work out for all of us, don't you?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't think. I just closed the curtains and scrambled backwards. I heard a car pull around. I heard rustling in the bushes out back. And from afar, I could hear my own voice a final time. "We'll be gone by morning at Waptarencham," it said, "but we're never far away." A car drove off, leaving me in stunned silence, my mouth dry from hyperventilating. The next morning, they were gone. The basement was empty, and they even left a thank you note. Attached to it was a Polaroid picture of a happy family, a mom, a dad, 2 kids, and a funny uncle. One that looked exactly like me, and I have been contemplating on whether to share this for some time, knowing what they could do. But I believe they're not technically proficient enough to find this, and I've omitted a lot of details. I just need to know if anyone has met something similar, and if so, how you managed to put it behind you. Are they still out there? Are they watching me? How many suits do they have? I wanted to just put this behind me and pretend it never happened, but it's getting harder and harder. Every now and then, I see someone that looks vaguely like them, an Anders with a different haircut, a Layla that's slightly younger. School photos with an Aiden or Alvin, but a different hair color. And a few weeks ago, I got a call from a friend mentioning how they'd seen me in the local newspaper. Only thing is, I've never been in it. I've considered moving somewhere far, far away. But first, I just need to get this out. I need someone to believe me. The real me, and not the me you might see in the papers. I've always associated my birthday with that depressing time of year where a cozy autumn turns into an early winter decay, where colorful leaves die, leaving a withered brown shell behind. Still, people are expected to celebrate their birthdays. It's strange if one doesn't. I don't. My fiance recently asked me why I never celebrate my birthday, and it's a hard one to explain. When you've been through something traumatic, everything sort of brings you back to that moment, one way or the other. And while I'd love to tell her about it, I don't think I can without sounding like a maniac. I thought I'd start by just telling my story anonymously and sort of go from there. It was the year I turned 13. Since You've Been Gone was blasting on the radio every hour of the day. My friends and I were quoting How I Met Your Mother religiously. It was a good time to be a kid. Since my birthday was in the middle of the school week, my big birthday plans were postponed until the upcoming weekend. Still, I couldn't complain. Birthday cake on a Tuesday didn't sound all that bad. I got home, had a small celebration with my parents, and opened a few presents. 2 new games for my PlayStation 2. Score! I finished up my homework and browsed the net for a few hours ahead of my scheduled bedtime when there was a knock at the door. We rarely had visitors, so to have someone knocking at our door at 10 p.m. was unusual, to say the least. My parents had already opened the door by the time I was halfway down the stairs. There was a man in a fancy jacket with a clipboard standing outside, along with 2 armed guards. I sort of fell into the middle of the conversation.
So we need you to sign the consent form, and we'll get started,
the clipboard man said.
Any questions?
This can't be legal.
My mom said.
On what kind of authority are you?
Ma'am, this is an emergency. We have been authorized to bring anyone and everyone if need be. But I promise you it'll be a less pleasant experience than what you could achieve here in the comfort of your own home.
As the discussion continued, the armed men pushed into the house. They had a sort of checklist they were going through, asking questions as they poked and prodded. Someone mentioned a satellite phone, which we didn't have. I hurried back upstairs. From my window, I could see them putting wheel locks on our car. They were testing some sort of electrical equipment too, and as they did, I could see the internet connection on my computer disappear. My cell phone lost all bars, and while I didn't check, I suspected they'd done something to our landline as well. They were isolating us, putting us under some sort of lockdown. I still didn't have the slightest idea of who these people were. There were no patches, badges, ranks, or symbols. Just a bunch of serious-looking men in windbreakers with visible gun holsters. After a few minutes, one of the men entered my room. My parents were worried sick, but were told to wait outside. The man was about 6'4" and had the look of someone who could kill me with his bare teeth if need be. Without a word, he started to go through my things.
You got any walkie-talkies?
He asked.
Any radio science projects, something like that?
Nope, I said, shaking my head. I got a PlayStation 2?
That can go online, right?
I never got the chance to answer before my mom added.
We don't let him play online games.
She said.
It can't do that.
As if to make sure, he pulled the power cable and dropped it in a sealed bag along with various knickknacks and keys that he collected. They weren't taking any chances, and I wasn't playing my new games anytime soon, it seemed. As they finished up their impromptu house inspection, we were asked to gather downstairs. The fancy man with the clipboard cleared his throat, and the room fell deathly silent. Even my dad, who was usually a very assertive man, didn't have much to add to the conversation. That's how you knew it was serious.
For 72 hours, this and surrounding neighborhoods are under lockdown,
the man explained.
There is a localized problem related to a recent geological event, which has caused some unexpected issues. I'm sure you've noticed some minor oddities as of late.
Like what?
My dad added.
Milk turning sour, houseplants getting a strange color tint, swarms of frogs cluttering the roads.
My parents said nothing, but they nodded. Perhaps they'd seen something I hadn't. The man put down his clipboard as he explained, calmly.
You have been exposed to something akin to a chemical. It reacts violently to the release of certain hormones which are associated with deep REM sleep. To ensure ensure your safety, we are currently enforcing a temporary 72-hour ban on sleep.
Excuse me?
My dad took a step forward, but one of the armed men responded in kind. They both stopped before it had the chance to escalate.
Exposure was approximately 9 hours ago, meaning you have about 63 hours left to go. That'll be approximately 1 p.m. on Friday.
There is no way we can...
This is non-negotiable. This is a matter of your security, sir. We have an emergency health service site, but I can promise you that it won't be pleasant. You will be chemically induced into sleeplessness for the full duration of exposure until the event has passed. It can cause long-lasting brain damage.
We were handed a folder each, explaining our responsibilities and rights. An unmarked red folder with 3 papers, one explaining their right to force this upon us, another explaining that we'd already signed the consent papers, and a third one was a form explaining exactly when we could go to sleep. There was also an inventory form explaining the items we were to have returned at the end of the containment. They left a box of 50 glass vials, some kind of 4-hour booster shots. The man explained how underage children were not to take more than one every 7 hours, and that my mother, if pregnant, shouldn't take any at all. Luckily, my mom wasn't pregnant. I'm an only child. We were also given fiber bars with some kind of hormone supplement, unmarked and unbranded, but warm. Maybe they were made recently. The packaging was sloppy at best. The fancy man was trying his best to explain, and I could see my parents were eager to listen, but I barely understood half of it. Instead, I looked at the armed guards. They looked exhausted. Maybe they, too, weren't allowed to sleep. One of them had his mouth open and almost drooled, blinking one eye at a time. I could have sworn he nodded off for a second, which prompted him to take a walk outside.
I don't know if we can do this.
My mother complained.
It's a lot to ask. We've only just...
If at any point you can't do this, you need to call this number. It's the only number that works, the man said, pointing to the final line on the final page of the folder. If someone falls asleep and can't be awakened within a few minutes, they're in terrible danger. If that happens, try to keep them awake by any means until we can get here to pick them up.
And then they'll be...
taken to our site in Mankato, where they'll be chemically induced to stay awake.
So what exactly happens if someone doesn't make it?
My mom asked.
If we all just fall asleep?
The man shook his head, tapping the clipboard with his pen.
They will most probably die. Others might too.
While they went into the kitchen to explain the details, the angry-looking guard approached me with the sealed bag, handing me back my PlayStation 2 power cable. He gave me a pat on the shoulder.
I checked with the tech team,
he said.
You're good to go, and happy birthday.
I'd almost forgotten that it was my birthday. I appreciated the gesture, but I just couldn't bring myself to smile. I had too many questions bubbling in the back of my head, and I was too afraid to speak. They probably talked for another 20 minutes or so before the men left, leaving my parents and I alone in the kitchen. My mother was smoking under the kitchen fan. I'd only seen her smoke 2 times, once when she lost her job, and another time when her father got sick. Smoking in the kitchen was a surefire way to tell something was wrong. Dad was sitting with his arms crossed, looking at the box of booster shots.
This is not a joke,
my dad finally said.
This is very serious. We're all gonna need to help each other to get through this.
Mom said nothing, but I could see her hands trembling. She'd been crying. She was shaking so much that the ash from her cigarette didn't reach the ashtray. It just plopped down on the stove.
We can't be alone,
Dad continued.
We're gonna do our best to keep busy. You can play as many games as you want, but you can't fall asleep.
They gave back my power cable. I said, "Does that mean it's okay for me to use the PlayStation?"
It's okay.
Mom coughed.
It's okay, honey. Play your games.
For those first few hours, I didn't understand what the big deal was. No more school for the rest of the week, no bedtime, and unlimited screen time? That didn't sound too bad. I gamed late into the night. Sly 2 and Ratchet & Clank were on the menu, and I had a blast. I got some snacks along with one of those fiber bars. They tasted like twigs and raisins, but it made my brain calm. Not tired, but it made it easier to focus. It also made it harder to shut my eyes, making my eyelids itch. All lights in the house were kept on all throughout the night. Mom and Dad kept playing music on the downstairs stereo, and they desperately tried to keep me engaged. I was engaged enough just playing games, so I think it was more for their benefit rather than mine. At 5 a.m., Dad took his first booster shot. I could hear it all the way from upstairs. He was cussing pretty hard. Apparently, those things tasted like a mix of stale rice and death. Mom took her first boost about half an hour later, but she mixed it with orange juice. Apparently that helped. By 7 a.m., even I was feeling it. I'd never been up all night playing games like that on a school day before. Sure, I'd pulled all-nighters with my friends, but it was usually something we prepared for. So by early morning, I could feel myself nodding off. My parents were checking in on me every now and then and decided to act. We were having family breakfast, pretending as if we'd already slept.
You're always cranky in the morning.
Mom said.
Try to imagine. This is just that. Another cranky morning.
I knew for a fact that they'd slipped one of the boosters into my cereal. I saw 3 empty vials on the counter, and I knew none of them had taken a second one yet. Still, I had little choice but to try. We weren't even halfway through the containment yet. As we finished our breakfast, we could hear commotion outside. I was upstairs brushing my teeth, watching through the hallway window. It was our neighbors. Larry Peterson, the 55-year-old man who worked the fishing supplies at the local mini-mall, crawled out his front door. He was throwing up something black and blue onto the pavement. I'd never seen this man do anything more physically straining than trying to start a lawnmower, and now he was crawling on all fours like his life depended on it. I could hear his wife calling out from inside. She was screaming at him, but I couldn't hear what. Larry got up and almost leapt into the back of his pickup truck in a show of athleticism I'd never seen from him before. It wasn't until his wife got out of the house that I could hear what she was saying.
Larry.
She cried,
Larry, wake up.
I saw Larry Peterson grab a wrench, get out of the truck, and grab his wife by the hair. Suddenly, a hand covered my eyes as my father dragged me away from the window. I could hear a scream turn into a gargle, followed by a hearty laugh, one I'd heard 1,000 times before. The same kind of laugh Larry Peterson would chuckle up whenever my dad tried to pull off a bad pun. My mind painted me a picture of what had happened, and it wasn't pretty. My dad spun me around and stared into my eyes. I could tell he wasn't himself. There were lines across his face that I hadn't seen before.
Stay with me and Mom,
he said.
Don't look outside. People are getting sick.
Are we getting sick, Dad? I asked, a yawn escaping me. He shook me a little, as if to make sure I was paying attention.
We'll be fine,
he said.
It's just a matter of time, but I don't want you to see people getting hurt. Larry isn't feeling well.
There was a knock on the front door. Dad took point as Mom hid in the bedroom. I remember standing on the top of the stairs looking over the railing to the floor below. There was a violent, angry pounding on the door. Larry Peterson's soft chuckle coming from the other side. He didn't say anything. He just pounded on the door with his wrench, laughing as he tried to get in. He went around the house rattling our windows. He didn't get far before we could hear a car roll up. There was a popping sound, but not like a gunshot. I think they tased him. By the time I could hear Larry Peterson get dragged off, my mom had come upstairs with a smile taped to her face, asking me to show her how far I'd gotten in my fancy new video games. She was clearly trying to keep me distracted, but I didn't mind. At that point, I wanted desperately to be distracted. I could imagine Larry Peterson on the other side of the front door, his white t-shirt stained with that strange black and blue goo he'd thrown up, wielding that wrench with a manic grip. The thing was as large as my arm and solid metal. I'd never considered it a weapon, but thinking about it made my blood run cold. Had he really killed Mrs. Peterson? Why? Mom and I spent the next few hours playing video games. We also made a plan. We went through our old DVDs and decided on a watching schedule. She'd originally planned a walk, but now we weren't to leave the house. She didn't want to say why, but I had the feeling that there was something outside the Petersons' house that she didn't want me to see. Bloodstains, maybe. I was too afraid to find out. My parents tried their best to keep the mood up, but I could tell it was getting to them. My dad was mostly just standing there, leaning against the door, staring straight ahead like in a trance. Mom tried to occupy herself by playing games and watching DVDs with me, but she was counting the minutes until she could get her next booster shot. I wasn't eager to take one. They made my stomach all queasy. We made it all the way until noon. Dad was having trouble staying up and kept washing his head with cold water. He tried to keep busy doing housework that he'd kept for a rainy day, but there were constant distractions. We could hear sirens in the distance, and at one point there was someone spraying our front door and windows with a high-pressure water hose, possibly to wash away the last traces of Larry Peterson. There were dog patrols going up and down the street, along with the occasional phone call. The one number that still worked where someone called to make sure we were all awake and accounted for. By dinner time, Mom was having stomach troubles. Her shaking had gotten worse, and she was having trouble with sudden change of smells. Dad kept rubbing his eyes and checking his watch, getting up every 10 minutes or so just to move around. We had decided that we were going to play board games after dinner, but Mom was having trouble keeping herself from throwing up. We ended up just reheating a lasagna from a few days back. I didn't mind. Mom made amazing lasagna, but my appetite was quickly lost when I saw my mother barely keeping it together. She kept drooling and making this weird chugging sound. She was blinking slower and slower. Dad tried to get her to eat one of the fiber bars, but she just ran out of the kitchen, locking herself in the bathroom. It was touch and go for a while. I could feel my heart racing as Dad tried to convince her to unlock the door, but she just couldn't do it. After a while, she stopped responding. Dad had to break the handle with a hammer, but it was too late. She was already sleeping. I could hear it through the door. As the door burst open, Mom had only been asleep for a couple of seconds, a minute at most, but she was sitting on the toilet, her head leaning back, and something was coming out of her mouth. Black and blue fingertips poking out over the edge of her lips. Her throat undulated. The moment Dad grabbed her, she tipped her head forward, coughing. Dad washed her face in the sink while yelling at me to wait in the other room. For a few minutes, I was just sitting there, ready to run or hide. It might have been too late, I figured. She could have already been affected, like Larry Peterson. I could hear them arguing in the other room, and as their voices went from angry to desperate to sad, I didn't know what to do. When they finally returned, they sat me down to explain that we were going to be fine, that we were almost halfway through and that we were in the home stretch. They were so kind, warm, and careful in the way they explained it, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I had trouble focusing, and all I could think about was that strange noise I kept hearing in the background. Something outside. Dad was halfway through explaining how we weren't going to lock our bathroom doors anymore, when something in me screamed at me to react. It was just a slight click, but it was clear as day. Maybe it was those booster shots, but I kept hyper-focusing on little details rather than big picture stuff, like an actual conversation taking place in front of me. I closed my eyes, and no less than a second later, a loud bang. Someone was shooting at us. It was only a couple of shots when we dropped to the ground. One shot got lodged in the front door, while the other cracked the kitchen window. There were loud voices outside, laughing hysterically. They were talking but barely making any sense. One of them sounded like she was trying to talk with food in her mouth. Mom and Dad kept quiet as two more shots popped off, one of them hitting the kitchen light. With an electric spark, it gave out, blacking out most of the kitchen. I could hear someone running and laughing as they continued down the street. In the distance, there was more gunfire. Maybe someone responding in kind.
We can't stay here.
Mom whispered.
We gotta call them.
You want to go to where they put Larry?
Dad answered.
To be in a whole hospital full of these people? They're shooting at us. We can't just...
Mom quieted down and looked at me. She and Dad excused themselves to talk in private while I was asked to move upstairs. I was to stay away from windows, and I couldn't sit or lie down. They'd be up to check on me in a bit, but of course I was too curious. While still hearing them argue downstairs, I checked an upstairs window. I could see pretty far down the street, and in the distance I could make out a car stalling on the side of the road. The headlights were still on, but it was surrounded by at least 6 people. 2 of them were dressed like the armed guards we'd seen earlier. It took me a while to realize there was an old man sitting in that car. I'd seen him around a couple of times, but I didn't know his name. The surrounding people were trying to crack the car windows with various weapons, tire irons, bricks, hammers, lead pipes, whatever they could get their hands on. It didn't take them long to break through. They reached in to pull the man out. It was too far off for me to hear his screams, but I could vaguely see what they were doing. They held him down and covered his face with their hands. His eyes, his mouth, his ears, leaving only his nose to breathe through. Then they just sat there. It took me a moment to realize what they were doing. They were forcing him to sleep. After a few minutes, they let go of him. The old man slowly stood up, leaned against his car, and started to dry heave. After a while, the same blue and black goo that I'd seen from Larry Peterson started pouring out of his mouth, stopping only as he coughed up some kind of clot that could barely fit in his mouth. A clot that moved. As he straightened his back, he looked at the strange group, and they walked down the street together. Some jogged, some sprinted. One of them crawled, but it looked like he held on to something with his teeth. Either that or something was coming out of his mouth. Something long. As they hurried down the street, I could hear more gunfire. In the distance, coming from another way, I could see another group of people. At least a dozen, but heading in another direction. Roaming gangs of sleep-deprived sick people. God knows how this thing affected them long term. When my parents were done discussing, they sat me down to explain that we were going to stay indoors and keep away from the windows, just in case. We were locking all doors and windows, closing all curtains, and not playing anything louder than necessary. We were to draw as little attention as possible. Of course I agreed. What choice did I have? That night I could tell things were deteriorating. Dad almost took a double dose of booster shots as he forgot he'd taken the first one, but Mom stopped him. There were no phone calls coming in. They'd stopped checking in on us. Mom even tried calling, but the line had been disconnected. The gunfire outside was further away, but more frequent. We could hear cars honking, but no sirens. Then there were fires, at least two, somewhere downtown. We could see the smokestacks from afar. Mom wasn't doing well. She couldn't eat, and at times she could barely stay on her feet. She kept talking out loud even if no one was in the room with her, and she had to lean against things to stay upright. She couldn't keep the fiber bars down, and she walked around with her head bobbing back and forth. Dad tried his best to keep her active, but he was having trouble as well. No matter how many cold splashes he took to the face, he just couldn't stay attentive. I wasn't doing well either, but nowhere near as bad. I still had my appetite, and I took my booster shots, but I could feel the side effects. My hands kept shaking, and I had a nasty headache. There were these pinches down my neck like someone was shocking me with a wet battery. I'd imagine things moving just outside of my vision. I kept turning around to look at the windows as I started to hallucinate that they were screens. By morning, there was a new problem. Both the power and the water had been cut. There was a small lake a short walk from the house, and we had no choice but to try and get some water by hand. We had some drinking water stocked in the kitchen, but we needed some for the bathroom. Mom volunteered to go, but that was out of the question. She could barely stand or make a coherent sentence. There was no discussion. Dad had to do it. We watched him from one of the upstairs windows. The sun had just risen, bathing the withering landscape in long, sharp shadows in a sickly bright glow. Mom was just staring blankly ahead, as if trying to remember what was so important.
Isn't it your birthday soon?
She said out loud. That was Tuesday, I responded.
Did you wish for you to get older?
She asked.
I wish for that. I want you to be able to get older.
She looked at me and laughed maniacally. She blinked one eye at a time, her left eye lingering a little longer than her right. Her eyes were sunken and dark, and she kept going cross-eyed. I think she meant well, but that look she gave me was nothing short of terrifying. It was like she'd been reduced to her most basic self. My mom was still in there somewhere, but most of it was just gone. After about an hour, I spotted Dad coming back. Mom and I were both relieved, but it didn't last long. I noticed he wasn't carrying any water. Moments later, I could see he wasn't alone. There were about 24 more people coming with him. Mom didn't seem to react. She just looked out the window and nodded to herself. For a moment, she was almost falling asleep standing up, her mouth moving up and down on its own like a bass out of water. I could see something moving in her throat. I shook her, and in a moment of clarity, she looked out the window again. As I heard something pound against the door downstairs, Mom pushed me into the closet. She ran downstairs to get the remaining booster shots and dropped it all on me, along with her wristwatch and a couple of fiber bars.
Someone will come get you, she said. Just wait and stay awake. I'll try to think of something.
I didn't have the time to protest before she slammed the closet shut. I could hear a key slide into the lock downstairs. Dad may have forgotten something about who he was, but he hadn't forgotten how to use the house keys. I just sat there in the dark, listening. I curled up into a ball, but I didn't want to get too comfortable. I could hear furniture being turned over, unfamiliar voices yelling obscenities or incoherent nonsense. A fight broke out, and I could hear someone throwing something. Another person ran up the stairs and into the bathroom, repeatedly kicking the bathtub. A woman screamed, then a man. There was a gunshot, followed by windows being broken. I could hear a muffled scream as if someone was held down, maybe like they did with the old man outside the night before. I must have sat there for hours. In the dark, it was hard to tell if my eyes were open or not. I couldn't tell if I was really hearing something outside or if I was just imagining it. I could hear voices and whispers, but they didn't seem to make sense. Sometimes I imagined them standing just outside my door, asking me for the cheat codes for the games I'd played. All I had to keep my waning sanity company was my mom's wristwatch, and I could barely make it out. Time passed so strangely. I could be wrapped in a thought for what felt like hours, but only minutes passed. Then I'd catch myself staring straight ahead, and 2 hours could disappear. I kept repeating the next scheduled hour for the booster shot like a mantra. But things were getting stranger. The clock would go backwards. I'd imagine someone sitting across from me, a pair of white eyes staring back at me from the dark. There were little voices telling me to go to sleep, and I found myself nodding off. I could feel something moving in me, like a hand trying to fit into a glove. I finally gave up and got out of the closet. I could barely stand as I dragged the booster shots and fiber bars along in a plastic bag. I didn't care if there was anyone downstairs. I needed to see something. I needed light or some kind of stimuli. The whole house was trashed, every piece of furniture broken, every light smashed. There was blood spatter on the walls, and the front door was hanging on a single hinge. Every window was smashed, and our picture frames had been thrown across the room like ninja stars. But the strangest thing was an acrid smell coming from the kitchen. At first, I didn't understand what it was. It looked like a person, but there was the wrong number of limbs. After a few seconds of adjustment and trying to force myself to clarity, I realized it was a dead body. A young man with a knife sticking out of his chest, splayed out on the kitchen floor. His jaw was extended and broken on one side. There was a black and blue arm reaching out of his throat, reaching upwards to grab his own head. Something in me stirred. Something in me didn't like what I was looking at, and I wasn't sure if it was me or something else. I tried to push it down with a fiber bar, which strangely worked. I made my way outside in a daze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to find my parents. Another part of me wanted to get out of town. I wanted to look for a bike, or just start walking or catch a bus. Of course, there were no buses to catch, but my sleep-deprived mind couldn't separate fact from fiction anymore. That entire night was one long, living nightmare. I kept imagining things coming out from the dark. I could hear voices telling me to turn around, to stop, to run, all at once and none at all. I could barely keep my balance, and stopping even for a moment would send me straight to sleep. I had to keep going. I even took an extra booster shot, which just gave me this sharp joint pain and made me sweat. I could tell I'd done something stupid. I took a shortcut through the park. I could see faces coming out of the trees. I saw a man lying face down on the gravel path, being pulled forward by an arm coming out of his mouth. I saw a man out by the lake, repeatedly slapping his arms against the cold water surface, like a manic child trying to get as high a splash as possible. Some of it was real, some of it wasn't. I couldn't tell which was which, not anymore. When I finally reached downtown, I saw at least 24 people gathered outside a burning building. All of them with black and blue arms reaching out of their mouths, stretching toward the flames, as if slowly wafting air towards them. Like human kelp moving against an invisible current, they leaned back and forth in unison, praising whatever chaos they caused without a word or sound. And yet I could hear them, welcoming me, beckoning me. All voices unique, carried to me by an unfelt wind.
Come closer.
It begged.
You belong here.
I turned away and the voices grew louder, desperate, screeching, demanding my attention, my devotion. Some of them coming from outside, some of them coming from the rumble of my stomach.
It's already here.
It laughed.
It'll never go away. It'll never sleep. It'll never stop.
Hands reached for me, a face in every window, voices reaching from beneath the concrete, gunfire, broken windows, glass cracking under my rubber boots as I shuffled past burnout cars. It was dark, then bright, then dark again. And at some point I succumbed. I felt concrete against my cheek, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. My legs wouldn't move, my eyes wouldn't open.
Yes.
The voices laughed.
Come to us. Come burn with us.
And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was out. Hours, maybe half a day. I woke up to see a man running towards me, asking me if I was okay. A car had pulled over, bathing me in a warm light. By the side of the road, a colony of frogs looked at me. In the distance, my eyes landed on a discolored sunflower. It had turned blue. Strange how you don't notice the most obvious changes until they stare at you in the face. Turns out, exposure had happened at least 6 hours earlier than the man with the clipboard had predicted, and I'd been awake long enough for most of the effect to pass through my system. I was found unconscious by the side of the highway, about 9 miles from my house. While I did have an uncomfortable, dreamless sleep, the effects it had on me were nowhere near as bad as what had happened to most of the neighborhood. I'm sure you've heard of it. Riots, they called it. Just another mess up in a low-income area. I don't even think it reached national news. Some of the people who succumbed to it early got permanent brain damage. Larry Peterson was never the same, but it was hard to tell if it was because of the emotional trauma or the sleep thing. Either way, he had to have a nurse come look after him a few times a week for the rest of his life. Mom and Dad weren't completely unharmed either. Mom developed some kind of narcolepsy after that night, spontaneously nodding off at the most inopportune times. Dad lost his sense of taste and smell. To this day, they're having a hard time explaining what exactly they experienced. To them, it was just like going to sleep and having the most horrible nightmare, only to wake up in a hospital bed. Sometimes I wonder if I did fall asleep. Some of the things I saw were so strange that there was no way to tell if they were real or not. I vividly remember that scene of hands waving back and forth outside that burning building downtown. It had to be real. That building really did burn. As you might imagine, I have a hard time looking back at this. Thinking too much about it gives me this icy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Like a small part of me believes that this is all just a big nightmare, that I'm still just a clock's tick away from waking up in that closet with someone standing just outside waiting for me. Or maybe it's something inside of me, still waiting to grab the reins. Maybe it's just a night away,